By the late 1990s, BC had about a quarter of all of the coastal temperate rainforest that was left in the world. That is an enormous responsibility for British Columbia, and also our opportunity to give that gem back to the world.
When we started this campaign, the area was known as the Mid-Coast Timber Supply Area, and every valley almost was slated to be roaded and logged. The logging companies were very angry. We were the ones who were making their lives difficult.
And the tensions were high. If you can picture Greenpeace sitting across the table from a logger. And we were stuck in the same room, and we had to come up with solutions.
Failure was not an option with this process. We had to succeed.
When you go to visit the Great Bear Rainforest, you leave Vancouver, which is pretty much right on the border of the United States and Canada, and you have to fly north for about an hour and a half. And as you're flying north, all of a sudden magically there's this forest in front of you that's really largely intact. It's an amazing place because you have trees that are over 1,000 years old. And when you think of it that way, you know, when Columbus first came to North America, some of these trees were already old growth. So most of the forest is still pristine. There's a huge number of grizzly bears and also Kermode bears that live within the Great Bear Rainforest. So it's teeming with life, and it's really one of the most magnificent places on the planet. In 1996 and 1997, there was a widely held perception that the government of British Columbia and the governments in Canada were protecting the forests. In large part because the governments kept telling everyone that they were protecting the forest. Logging companies were allowed to go in and clear-cut the remaining intact valleys of the Great Bear Rainforest, even though the First Nations had never actually ceded the rights to their territories or signed treaties with the government. So we went there along with a few other environmental groups and stood with them to try to stop the clear-cutting.
Yes, I'm going to ask you politely that you step aside so these guys can go to work, and if you're not prepared to do that, then I want you to know that that's an illegal activity and we're going to carry on.
There were a large number of logging industry workers concerned that our efforts to stop the clear-cutting would mean that the companies that employed them would stop making profits and that they would lose their jobs. But the reality is that you could log differently and still manage to keep jobs in the forest. But it was such a polarized time and such a polarized debate. The RCMP came in to arrest everyone who was there. And this included people like head hereditary chief of the Newhawk Nation, who at that point was over 70 years of age. We stopped the clear cutting in that particular site, so it was a very large logging company. So as people were trying to stop the logging in one place and succeeded, you could still hear all the chainsaws everywhere around us. We knew that we couldn't protect this region with protests, and we couldn't protect it with just getting some publicity around the area. We needed power, and our environmental voices were not going to be enough. And so we went to the customers of the coastal wood products. We went to companies like Home Depot, IKEA, Lowe's, the German pulp and paper industry, BBC Magazine, and we showed them, this is what you're buying. You're buying the destruction of the last, largest, unprotected temperate rainforest left on the planet.
Many customers came to British Columbia, and I remember the German pulp and paper industry. They flew over the area and saw the clear cuts, and then they turned to the government and the logging companies and said, "You told us your logging practices were like a black Mercedes, and what you've just shown us is a red Datsun." And they said to the BC government, "You've got a problem, you need to solve this." Home Depot came along a few days later and said, "We're not going to buy wood that comes from endangered forests." Lowe's did the same a week later. Those companies together represent over $1 billion of sales from British Columbia every year.
Boycotts of BC lumber, confrontation between companies and environmentalists.
The IWA is upset because they say by reducing the amount of lumber to be cut, jobs will be lost.
The logging companies were very angry, and they really didn't like us. We were the ones who were making their lives difficult. So a mediator was hired by the government, and we discussed the impasse that we were at. And that was that we were both hurting each other, but we were not getting what we wanted. And we needed to find a way to move forward. And that's when the negotiations started. We started out as enemies, hardly able to speak to each other. And from there, we negotiated what was the biggest moratorium that had ever been put in place in British Columbia. And we created a truce. And that gave us the time and the space to work out a solution. And what we needed to get us there was some kind of independent science.
Industry and government science tended to be quite timber focused, so it didn't ask a lot of the questions that we would want to ask in a planning process. Instead, they would look at, where is the best timber areas to log? If we have to protect grizzly habitat, how can we do it with the least amount of impact on timber supply? So it came from a different opening perspective than we would usually choose. When we pulled our science team together, they asked questions like, what would it take to sufficiently protect salmon habitat, bear habitat? And they asked how much old growth needs to be retained to protect the ecological integrity of this region. After we arrived at the table with our maps, and they look very different than industry's, we kind of fell into this process of dueling scientists. So industry would say, we don't need to protect this much, we can get away with just a little bit. And we'd say, well, our scientists say that we have to protect all of this. And we got into this whole he said, she said. And the other participants got to watch this, and I'm sure it was all very entertaining, but it wasn't terribly constructive. We recognized we needed to change the science that was informing the negotiations among the different parties at the table. A team of scientists were pulled together, and everybody agreed on who was going to participate. That was part of the terms of reference. The main question that the Coast Information team started with was, if you were to protect the ecological integrity of the Great Bear Rainforest, how much of it would you have to protect? One of the contexts that we brought was trying to look at this region as part of a much bigger picture. After all, it was only in 1997 that the Sierra Club had come out with its map of Canada's coastal temperate rainforest, showing the coast of BC and the kind of logging that had already happened in the old-growth rainforest. And it's pretty amazing when you look at this map and you start around Vancouver, Victoria area where everybody lives, and it's used yellow for where everything had been logged. And as you move up the coast, there's still lots and lots of yellow. You can see some of the green that's left where the old growth is left. But as you move further and further north, you start to see there's an area where there still is quite a bit of green. And you look at that and you think, wow, there's a conservation opportunity. And you also think there's a huge global responsibility that BC has. In the end, the science came back recommending much higher levels of protection than industry or government had been pushing at the beginning of the negotiations. And it really reinforced for us that we were asking for the right things right from the beginning, and that we were right to change the whole process around science.
At the same time that the science was being developed, we were at a table with a bunch of stakeholders, including industry, labor, communities, and the tensions were high. If you can picture Greenpeace sitting across the table from a logger. Everybody thought they knew each other's positions. Environmentalists were seen as they want to take away our jobs. They want every tree in the rainforest to stay standing, and they don't care about me as a logger. And environmentalists perhaps had the understanding that people would fight for their jobs regardless of whether those jobs would only be around for a couple of years. So there was a lot of debating. As you can imagine, we had different interests. And that process went on for 7 years.
It will be based on a collaborative process.
There was a point in time where we realized there was actually a need to create a joint vision if we wanted to be heard at a higher level within government. Essentially in December 2003, after staying up all night to sort of hammer on what that shared vision could be, we hit a critical moment. It was remarkable that all of these parties came together. You had the mining industry, the logging industry, communities, the labor unions, as well as Greenpeace and the environmentalists come together and articulate a shared vision for what needs to happen in the Great Bear Rainforest. So it was a very difficult ending to the day, and following that ending I actually had a small business truck logger come to me and say, I never thought I would talk to a Greenpeacer, let alone admire and respect the integrity they brought to their work. We collectively created a vision that we wrote down in a 60-page document. So that document was sent to government. It was considered a recommendation from all of these diverse parties for what needs to happen in the Great Bear Rainforest.
The main thing that the environmental community brought was their power. And you marry that with First Nations power, you have a different kind of power. And to take that and wield that on industry and wield that on government is a pretty formidable force. But by and large, over and above that, there was a tremendous amount of intelligence brought to the table about how to do things. And so you combine that intelligence and you combine it with First Nations traditional knowledge about their territories and how to do things. You then have more knowledge and wisdom than government is able to bring to the table and industry is able to bring to the table. You put all those things together and at the end of the day you've got something that people have a very, very difficult time pushing aside because it's been well thought out. It has all of the right pieces.
Already we are hearing international voices praising those who are at the table and who have worked so hard to bring us to this day. The front page of the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post are congratulating the participants and saying you put the long-term interests of your province and the communities first. It is an important step in collaborative planning. This will forever preserve some of the largest intact temperate rainforest in the world.
As a result of this announcement, a tremendous opportunity exists for British Columbia. As these new forest practices unfold on the ground, it sets the stage for us to take advantage of a growing market demand for green wood and paper products. And now, the challenge really begins to make these ideas become a reality. The agreement meant that over 5 million acres are protected from logging, and this includes over 100 valleys. Some of the big valleys, some of the most ecologically significant valleys, large core areas are being spared from the chainsaws and the roads that would have gone into them.
This is the only place in the world where at such a large scale, across 15 million acres, a holistic approach to managing our forests is being applied. One of the key focuses in this approach is forestry, and essentially a forest company has to decide what to leave behind before it decides what to cut. So this is better for the rainforest because it ultimately leads to lighter touch forestry.
Industrial logging never did provide a lot of economic benefits for local communities. 9 out of 10 jobs went to people that lived outside of the region. They were flown into logging camps and they were flown home. One of the key things that we needed to create was an economy that would produce local, stable jobs. For our part, environmentalists have raised $60 million to contribute towards human well-being in First Nations communities. That's an enormous achievement for the environmental community.
What this Great Bear Rainforest Agreement is a story of hope. It shows how we can do conservation in the 21st century, where we respect both people and wilderness.
Other places around the world are interested in seeing if British Columbia can take these agreements on paper and actually translate them into a reality in the rainforest.
One of the biggest challenges that we face is actually making the commitments real on the ground. There are voluntary commitments that the industry made to us more than 2 years ago, and while some changes have been made, a lot of the key ones have not.
We are at a point now where we've got to implement this in a way that it sustains what we have decided. So we need now to implement and secure the conservation that is out there now. We need an economy that's a conservation economy. It has to be based on that. And if we can't create that, then the durability of these agreements, I would say they're pretty tenuous. I wouldn't expect them to last unless we can develop an economy that protects them.
The commitment the government and industry made is that significant change is going to happen to the way forestry happens on the ground by March 2009, and that new system is called ecosystem-based management. So Forest Ethics and the other organizations, we're going to be holding them accountable to that promise. We're going to be tracking milestones and reporting out to the world on whether they've met their commitments. And in order for those commitments to be met, they're going to have to start change on the ground right now.
The new logging practices are an absolutely essential part of protecting ecological integrity. The protected areas alone are not enough. We need to see that change on the ground, or we have to go back out to the world and say, you know, it wasn't saved the way that we thought it was.
I'll leave you with this thought. Whatever you can do or dream you can do, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. The boldness of the participants in the Central and the North Coast has given us all a little bit of magic. Thank you very much.